the audience, without whom the beautiful speeches that have been made here would not have the beauty that they now have acquired. You know, when one is asked to talk about leadership in Africa, one's mind wanders in many directions, because in the recent past, the continent of Africa has been the subject of scrutiny from many quarters. There are those who are Afro-pessimists and take the view that Africa will never realize our potential. There are those Afro-optimists who take the view that the jury is still out on the success or otherwise of the continent of Africa. I am an Afro-optimist. I take the view that this continent has had a glorious past, and that this continent has had her trials and tribulations, but her better days are in the future. There are those who, when talking about Africa, are in the habit of dealing with Africa as if it were one monolithic block. They do not recognize that the beauty of Africa is in her diversity. And indeed, when you care to undertake a geographical survey of Africa, you will be amazed at what the west of Africa offers, what the center of Africa offers, what the south of Africa offers, what the Horn of Africa offers, and what the north of Africa offers. That is the continent that we are talking about today. And we are talking about her because she continues in many ways to punch below her weight. And many are the commentators who take the view that the reason why she continues to punch below her weight is because the men and women who have had the privilege and honor to serve her in different political capacities or leadership capacities have not served her well. There may be merit in that assessment, but those who are quick to judge, those whose only claim to fame is that they are professional fault finders, must ask many questions before they judge and condemn Africa unfairly. This continent, and I remember, and if we are to judge this continent fairly, we must go back to the past and look to the past and ask about this continent. And there are many who have written about this continent. How many of you here will forget the great writings of Senegal's Anta Diop, who has documented in many ways the glorious past of the continent of Africa, the great kingdoms in Africa? When Europe was still in the caves, Africans were building monuments. If they were not building them in the Ashanti Empire, they were building them in Monomotapa here in Zimbabwe. And there is a sense in which all those have been consigned to the Museum of History. And those who look at Africa see Africa as a scar on the conscience of humanity, not remembering that they were themselves co-authors of Africa's misfortunes. We are the only continent and the only people in the world who have been commodified. How many of you will remember that agrarian Europe had to commodify Africa in order to realize our level of development? At one time in those early days, we will remember, even as we talk about leadership, that half of the population of this continent was taken away. If they were not taken away from Ghana, which they then christened Gold Coast. They were taken away from Angola. If they were not taken away from Angola, they were taken away from Mozambique. If they were not taken from Mozambique, they were taken from Senegal. If the Arabs were not taking us, the Europeans were taking us. If the Europeans in their different tribes were not conquering us, they were stealing from us. Those are the realities that we don't talk about when we talk about this continent. And you know, if one cares to judge the African continent, one must be historically conscious. The oldest African country after we regained our independence from greater chief. And the question that we must ask ourselves, why is it that this continent finds ourselves in that space? If it is not Europe summoning us, it is the United States of America summoning us. Everybody is in the business of summoning us. One may ask, what has this to do with leadership? You know, I listened to the Chinese president speaking in eloquent Mandarin, saying how the relationship between Africa and China is a mutually beneficial relationship. He spoke about Africa as if it was one country. He did not remind himself, in my mind, that there are 55 countries in Africa, or 54 if you ask Morocco. And I listened to the Chinese president specifically mentioning the Gambia and a few other, and Sao Tome and Principe, that they were welcomed back to the world because they had renounced their relationship with Taiwan and they had now recognized the one China policy. Do I say this because there is anything wrong with China? No. I'm saying this because the Chinese are providing leadership for their people. They know exactly what they want for their people, and they are doing exactly what they want for their people for the benefit of their people. The question that I'm posing to us, do we know what we want for our people? Are we doing what we need for our people? And the answer is, I doubt. Why do I doubt? I doubt because at the end of the entire enterprise, the Chinese president said that he had given, or his government had given, 60 billion United States dollars to 54 African countries. Notionally, therefore, each country would be entitled to no more than 1.5 billion. Half of the presidents who are present in China, each one of them, half of them, can produce 1.5 billion. Sportsmen in Europe and America, including boxers, can earn $1 billion in a single bout. And we are here celebrating and singing the praises of China because they gave us 60 billion. Once again, it is a statement of their ability to recognize what leadership is all about. I'm submitting to us that when we interact with people like the Chinese, there is something to learn from them. We may condemn them at forums such as this, but there is wisdom in asking ourselves, how is it that this country, which about 30 years ago could not feed half our population, has in 30 years during our lifetime succeeded in pulling up nearly 800 million people out of poverty? How is it that every road that is now being built in Africa, whether the road is in Benin or in Nairobi, Kenya, or in Johannesburg, South Africa, or in Kigali, in Rwanda, or the Democratic Republic of Congo, there is a Chinese firm whose name I cannot pronounce as the contractor for that firm. How is it? How is it that China, which about 30 years ago did not produce a mobile phone, today out of every 10 mobile phones, we are using 6 which are from China. If it is not Techno, it is some other phone. If we are not inviting Jack Ma, we are inviting another Chinese, because we have seen that they have the ability to organize the affairs. Some of us, particularly those of us who are in the middle class, our pride is that our child is learning Mandarin as a second language, not isiZulu, Mandarin. I fear, Bishop, that in the next few years, when they bring their children for baptism, and you ask them, how do you name this child? They're saying, Deng Xiaoping Simfiwe. I'm still talking about leadership. We have seen what leadership can do. Leadership has catapulted China to another completely different orbit. We have seen that leadership has catapulted South Korea to a different orbit. We have seen that leadership has catapulted Vietnam, which was bombed to the ground in 1975. Vietnam now produces more coffee than all African countries combined. What have they done? The men and women who have been given the opportunity to serve those countries long recognize that leadership is about service. And I can't agree more with the Honorable Minister who spoke before me and the good Dr. Aaron who spoke before me, that the true essence of leadership is self-discovery and self-esteem. You know, where I come from in my tribe, and I know in many African communities, when you do something very well, they say, you have done it like a white man. When you arrive on time, they say, he has arrived like a white man. When you speak well, they say, you spoke like a white man. When you dress well, you dress like a white man. When you go to a beautiful place in Africa, you say, it does not look like Africa, as if Africans are incapable of doing the right things. And I'm telling us that until the day that we exercise the ghost of low self-esteem, Africa is going nowhere. I'm submitting to us that history has demonstrated times without number that personal conquest is the beginning of true leadership. If you don't conquer yourself, you are going nowhere. And I'm submitting to us that Africa must now recognize that whatever institutions you have, until and unless it is populated by men and women who have ideals, those institutions will collapse, never to be put together again. So going forward, ladies and gentlemen, I hold the view that a conference such as this, that brings together men and women who recognize that Africa should occupy her pride of place amongst the Committee of Nations, must be a conference at which we speak to each other honestly. I think we Africans have been too kind to each other for too long. The time has come that we must annoy each other. It is only when we have annoyed you sufficiently that we can canalize that anger, and that anger can then be used to move mountains. And my joy is that Africa is not sleeping. My joy is that Africans are now beginning to wake up to the reality that we have not only the intellectual wherewithal, but that we have the resources to make our countries grow and grow in the proper direction. You know, not so long ago, and not so long ago in this case means about 50 years ago, I read and listened to the leaders of the early days. If you listen to any one of those leaders, the clarity with which they were able to identify the problems of Africa and the clarity with which they were able to prescribe the medicine that could solve the problems of Africa was as titillating as it was as astounding. You know, I listen to the more casual works and I read the casual works of a young leader in the 1980s, such as Thomas Sankara. You know, Thomas Sankara is a young individual whose claim to formal education was not very much. He did not hold any PhD. He was an army officer. He overthrows the government of Upper Volta, and he goes into government and poses the question, why are we called Upper Volta? And he says the first thing that we must do is to change the name of this country so that it becomes Burkina Faso, the land of the upright man, and that the people of this country must be called the Burkinabe, the upright people. And he says we have been suffering with hunger and food shortages for too long. We have depended on France for too long. We can no longer be children and toddlers in our adulthood. We cannot be in economic and political diapers for too long. And he begins to release the country. And no sooner has he succeeded in doing this than the erstwhile colonial power says that this is a bad example. And they eliminate him. And not only Thomas Sankara. I remember the man for whom I am named in 1961, Patrice Emery Lumumba, only aged 36, and he recognizes, and on that day of independence, not being scheduled to speak, he speaks nevertheless, and he says how happy he is that the history of the Congolese will be written by the Congolese, and they take him away. I listened to Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah saying that Africa cannot be free unless the whole of it is free. I look at the casual works of Bantu Stephen Biko. I listen to the casual works of Samora Moises Machel. I read the casual works of Modibo Keita in Mali. I look at the works of Agostino Neto, the works of Africans who are clear. And those of you who are alive then, you could see that the indices of development in Africa were moving up north. If it was not infant mortality that was beginning to be lowered, it was maternal mortality and crude death rates. Africa was moving. But remember that Charles Darwin is still right. In this jungle that we call the world is survival of the fittest and the dying of the least suitable. When we begin to rise as a people, there are those whose only claim to success is to put us down, to tell us, not in so many words, that we are children of a lesser God. It is our duty to tell them that we are not. And that is why we have forums such as this. You know, there are those who may say, and I'm one of them, that perhaps in Africa we hold too many seminars, that we hold too many conferences, that we hold too many colloquia. But I hold the view that these things must be repeated time and time again, so that if they are clear, they become even clearer. Is it not true that gold must be in the fire and the furnace before it is refined? Is it not true that Africa has men and women, the 1.2 billion of us, that we have the ability to catapult this continent to a higher level? You know, there was a time that Africa deluded herself, that a leader was one in the nature of Moses, communing directly with God, and that this leader had a rod and staff, and that he would part the Red Sea of disease, and disease would disappear by pronouncement of abracadabra. That this leader would call and summon manna from heaven, and manna would fall. No, that is not leadership. Leadership is all of us, each one of us, in our little villages. The great American Ralph Waldo Emerson was right when he said, when we want the world to be clean, don't complain about the dirt in the world. Sweep your front yard and let your neighbor sweep their front yard. And lo and behold, when we have all swept, the world will be clean. I'm now on a spiritual dimension. Mother Teresa was also right when she said, when you go into a room and you find that there is darkness, don't complain about the darkness. Take a candle, light your candle, let your neighbor light a candle, and light will conquer the darkness. You know, I've been asked to give a concluding keynote address, not to preach and pontificate. So I must now move to conclude. And in my conclusion, warning you as I do, that having sat next to a politician, when I say conclude, that is the beginning of the second phase of my speech. But let me conclude by saying the following things. That this continent is now at crossroads. And when you are at crossroads, it means that you are faced with two roads. And you've got to make a conscious decision which is the road to take. And I think Africa made this decision. In the year 2013, the African leaders, whether you like them or not, that is another debate. You elected them, or they happen to be the leaders, and therefore they are the political leaders. And it is important to make a distinction between leadership in its broad sense and political leadership. Political leadership is the most visible leadership and the most effective in terms of marshalling all our resources and ensuring that they are coordinated in a manner that benefits us all. That is why political leadership is at the very heart of human development. The politicians sat in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia and came up with Agenda 2063. You know, Agenda 2063 says many things, but this is how I imagine Africa Agenda 2063. That in the year 2063, South Africa will have a GDP of 3 trillion United States dollars. And at that time, we shall not be measuring our GDP in dollar terms. We shall be measuring our GDP in Afro terms. Our currency will be called Afro. And the Afro will be the strongest currency in the world. And the GDP of South Africa will be 3 trillion. That the per capita income of South Africa will be 30,000 Afro. And that all our children will go and gain education from primary to university, the cost being underwritten by our taxes. That all our minerals will have a value addition. That we shall no longer be importing complete products from China. There will be a mobile phone. Namibia will be manufacturing a mobile phone. And that 1 million Africans will be using that mobile phone. That phone will be called Mobi-Africa. And Namibia will not stop there. I look to that day, Botswana will no longer be selling any cows to Europe. Those cows and the meat from Botswana will be consumed in the continent of Africa, and Lesotho will not be left behind. And Eswatini will also be a Shangri-La where we will go for tourism, and it will not stop there. Mozambique will have some of the biggest ports in Africa, and Tanzania will be there, and Malawi will be there, and Zambia will be there, and Angola will be there, and Equatorial Guinea will have new leaders, and Equatorial Guinea will be the equivalent of the Silicon Valley. In 2063, the Democratic Republic of Congo will no longer have any conflicts. We'll have power being generated from the Inga Dam, and I can assure you that at that time, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, and South Sudan, and Ethiopia, and Eritrea, and Somalia, and Djibouti, there'll be a road connecting all these countries. And it will not stop there. It will go on to Central African Republic. It will go on to Cameroon, and Gabon, and Benin, and Togo, and Sierra Leone, and Liberia, and the Gambia, and Mali, and Mauritania, and all these countries, and Sao Tome and Principe, and the Seychelles, and Mauritius, because there'll be leaders at that time. You know, In 1978, when I was reading Chinua Achebe's book, Things Fall Apart, the elders asked the question, and where are the young suckers that will grow when the old banana dies? Today I want to submit to you that where we sat, I saw old bananas. But when I look at this side, I see the young suckers that are growing when the old banana dies. And the truth of leadership, as I conclude, true leadership, Julius Kambarage Nyerere was right. If you are a true leader, you are not successful unless your successor succeeds. And this is the message that we must send to all African leaders. The other thing that we must tell our leaders, and we who are leaders wherever we are, is that leadership is a relay marathon race, and that leadership is intergenerational. You are not a leader unless you have grown leaders. And you are not a leader unless you are a servant. Jesus of Nazareth was right. He amongst you who wants to lead, he must be a servant. Our Africans of old were right that our chiefs were not rulers over us, but custodians. So, my friend Masiza, you have brought us to a good thing. For those of you who are present in this assembly, go out now into the world. Go out into the world knowing and recognizing that Africa will be built village by village. Go out into the world to know that you are the drop that will make the ocean overflow. Go out into the world recognizing what the Chinese long recognized, that the greatness of the ocean is because the ocean does not reject any river. So go out there and take the knowledge that is necessary. So go out into the world recognizing that Africa will fail or succeed on leadership, and leadership means servanthood. So go out there. The world has seen too many comedians. The world now wants actors who will serve. Go out and be blessed.